I want you all to look at this picture. Though it is from a movie, this picture is more important than maybe you know, because the film that this is from is based on a true story. And what you're looking at is a 14-year-old boy, tried and convicted of murder, being hooked to an electric chair. This really happened, and what is worse is the boy was completely innocent. Before we talk about this crime, we need to talk about some history. This case happened in 1944 in South Carolina. Any student of history can tell you what the world was like at that time in the South. South Carolina was segregated and had some pretty harsh laws, which included laws on the books that made it hard for black people to vote, which is against the Constitution, but I don't want to go into it because I want to focus on the crime at hand. But the voting laws will come into play later. This is called foreshadowing. Alcaloo, South Carolina was a mill town. Mostly everyone who lived there worked in some part of the mill that dominated the town. The mill would provide homes, stores, and other amenities, but it was segregated. The white houses were on one side of the town, and on the other side was the black homes. There are some articles that suggest that the railroad line was the dividing point, but I'm not going to go into that. In the white side of the town lived two girls. Betty June Binnicker, who was born in 1933, and Mary Emma Thames, who was born in 1937. As they were growing up, they were told by their parents to never go to the black side of town without adult supervision. But on March 22, 1944, the girls rode their bikes out looking for a fruit called a maypop. Searching for this elusive fruit caused them to cross the railroad tracks. There they saw a young 14-year-old boy along with his 7-year-old sister. The young 7-year-old seemed to be the 14-year-old's shadow, following him everywhere. Betty and Mary asked the two if they knew where to find maypops. The boy answered that he didn't know. So the two thanked them and went on their way, but they never returned home. A search party was formed that night, both white and black residents of the town. They searched well into the night and into the next day, but the little girls wouldn't be found until the afternoon of March 23rd, where behind the church on the African American side of town, their bodies were found in a ditch. They were dead, with Mary's bike laying on top of her. The wheel of the bike was broken. They had been beaten to death with a weapon thought to be a railroad spike. Police in the town now had a murder to contend with. And during the search for the missing girls, the police had been told by the 14-year-old boy that he and his sister saw them before they went missing. The 14-year-old boy was just trying to be helpful, but he was an African-American boy in the South. And police during this time would notoriously just pin crimes on the African-American community without bothering to look into details. That 14-year-old boy, a 5'1", 90-pound kid, was named George Stinney Jr. George Stinney Sr. worked at the local mill and along with his wife Amy had 5 children. John, who was 17, George Jr., who was 14, Charles, who was 12, Catherine, who was 10, and Amy, who was 7. From all accounts, the family was close. George Jr. went to the African American school in town where he was a bit of a troublemaker. Some called him a bully. He was accused of threatening to kill one kid, but he was a kid, and let's face it, kids can be stupid. But he seemed to enjoy the company of his siblings. His sister Amy was considered his shadow. She did a lot with him and followed him around no matter what he was doing. On March 22nd, she followed him out as he was leading the family cow to graze when Betty and Mary happened upon them. The four were cordial and went about their day. It wasn't until later that George Sr. volunteered to help search for the missing girls. As stated before, George Jr. did encounter the police and did tell them the last time he saw them, not knowing that he put himself in the crosshairs of suspicion. Not long after the girls were found did the police come to arrest George Jr. and John. Amy, who had been hiding in a pen, saw her brothers being hauled off, only yelling to George, "Are you leaving me?" George Jr. just told her to stay with her sister and brother and get a hold of their parents. Amy didn't know it then, but this would be the last time she would see her brother alive. Imagine being 14 years old. You're in a police interrogation room. Two officers are screaming at you. You are not allowed to go home. You are not allowed to see your parent. And worst of all, your rights are violated because you are denied a lawyer. This is what happened to George Jr. Officer H.S. Newman, racist or not, but probably racist, figured he had the right suspect. Newman didn't bother to investigate anyone else. The two girls were found on the African American side of town, and a black boy had told the police he had seen them last. In his ignorance, he decided George Jr. killed these girls. According to Newman, George told him where to find the murder weapon, which was a piece of iron that resembled a railroad spike, though no one remembers it being there and no one knows where it came from. There is also no proof that George said anything about this. These confessions were not recorded down. All we have is the word of H.S. Newman. The other part of the confession that Newman claimed was that George killed them over sexual reasons. I should point out here that the autopsy showed that the girls did not have any signs of sexual trauma. Also, these confessions were not written down. George did not admit to anything, though another confession claimed he killed the younger to force himself on the older of the two girls, which again, there is no evidence this happened to the girls. Within a day, without investigating anything, other than one little boy, interrogating him for hours without family or a lawyer present, the police closed the case. George Jr. was arrested while John was let go. Which I have to remind you, there is no evidence that proved George Jr. was responsible for the murder of Betty and Mary, and the confessions that he supposedly gave were not written down. In fact, to this day, the confessions do not exist, and the evidence that he did it also does not exist. If any of you are hoping that this would be settled by the court, and because lack of evidence alongside a suspicious confession would lead to a swift dismissal of the case, you would be wrong. A couple of things about this case. It was only 2 hours long. This was because the counsel that was provided to George Jr. was Charles Plowden, a man who was hoping to run for office, and thus he did nothing. The prosecution presented their case, and Plowden did nothing but sit there. No objections, no cross-examinations, nothing. He didn't call witnesses. The only thing he did was plead for the judge and jury to have mercy and sentence George Jr. to life in prison. We will get to the ruling in a second, but there is one more thing. George Jr.'s jury was all white, not even a sliver of George's peers. The reason for this was the only way to serve on a jury in South Carolina at the time is if you were a registered voter. Guess what Jim Crow laws did? Made it insanely hard for African Americans to register to vote. So the jury wasn't of George's peers. His attorney only cared to pander to voters rather than help a child. This was racism at its finest, because it took 10 minutes for the jury to find him guilty, and the judge sentenced him to death in the electric chair, which would happen June 16th, 1944. Guess when the trial was? April 24th, 1944. Do you think they had a time for an appeal? No. Hell, the only thing the state did for this boy was to keep where he was hidden to stop people from trying to lynch him. And George had to deal with all of this alone. His father, George Sr., was fired from the mill, and pressure from the town was too much. George Sr. and his family were all threatened, not just George Jr. George Sr. had to leave town because the town was threatening to lynch all of them as well. So sadly, there is no happy ending to this story. No one came to stop the execution from taking place. No last-second calls to stop it. On June 16, 1944, George Stinney Jr. was led to the electric chair. While no one stopped the execution, there were attempts to stop it. It wasn't long until the NAACP, the Stinney family, and some churches were attempting to appeal to the governor of South Carolina for clemency. Governor Olin Johnston did get those appeals, along with appeals from people who wanted the execution to happen. Johnston visited George Jr. in prison and then talked to Officer Newman. He allowed the execution to go on and wrote a letter as to why. I have just talked to the officer who made the arrest in the case. It may be interesting for you to know that Stinney killed the smaller girl to R-word the larger one. Then he killed the larger girl and R-worded her dead body. 20 minutes later, he returned and attempted to R-word her again, but her body was too cold. All of this he admitted himself, which for reference goes against the evidence. And again, this supposed confession was only told by Officer Newman. There was no record of this confession, nothing written down. But that year was an election year as well. Johnston had to appeal to his voters, which were the people pushing for the execution to happen. So the coward did jack shit. He took it all with face value. But let's get through this. It's going to get harder from here on out. George Jr. made a friend while he was awaiting execution. His cellmate, 17-year-old Wilford Hunter. Hunter stated that George Jr. was a good kid, that George tried his best to be strong, but the fear of knowing when his life was going to end was too much for the young boy. George Jr. proclaimed his innocence throughout the short amount of time he was on death row, never once confessing to a crime, because he didn't do it. Hunter had to console George Jr. at times, hugging the young boy and trying to comfort him. George asked Hunter, "Why would they kill me for something I didn't do?" George Stinney Jr. was led to the electric chair on June 16, 1944. He was a small boy, not much taller than 5 feet. He carried with him a Bible, which those in charge ended up making him sit on in order to make him tall enough for the chair. The straps designed to hold the prisoner's wrists down were too large for him. They had to be tied to him in order to secure him down. Tears rolled down his eyes as they put a mouthguard in his mouth, then attached the headpiece to his head. Finally, a mask was put over his face. Then they flipped the switch. The mask fell from his face as it was too big for him. The headpiece of the electric chair also slipped off. George Jr.'s eyes were wide, tears rolling down his cheeks. His mouth opened as if to scream, but nothing came out. They reset the mask and the headpiece and flipped the switch 2 more times, till he was pronounced dead. The families of Betty and Mary were in attendance and saw this. According to family members of Mary, Mary's father had looked forward to this execution, feeling George Jr. was the person who killed his daughter. But when he came home, what he saw changed him. He didn't feel relief that his daughter's murder had been avenged. He never spoke about it. He avoided the topic. But George Sr. would take his child, hold a small service for George Jr., then laid him to rest in an unmarked grave. Unmarked because he feared it would be vandalized. For 70 years, the world would move on, with the families of those affected thinking that it was over. George Jr. was labeled a killer when he was just a boy. For the Stinney family, it was a great injustice, one they felt that they could not right. For the families of Mary and Betty, justice had been served. But over 70 years later, the state of South Carolina would admit the truth, that George was innocent, and a gross injustice doesn't even begin to describe it. George Stinney Jr. was forgotten by time, his injustice left on the books but covered in dust. That was until 2004, when another George began to look into the case. George Frierson was a historian who grew up in that very small town. One day he came across an article about this case, and he made a decision to research this case, looking into the things that the police failed to look at. For instance, at the time of the murder, George had an alibi. His family claimed that he was with them when the murders would have took place. Frierson combed over the evidence that was there, looked at the possibility that something wasn't right, and his work garnered the attention of attorneys Steve McKenzie and Matt Burgess, along with Roy Brown and another attorney named James Moon. All of them looked over everything about this case and found examples of witness statements and evidence that could have exonerated George Jr. Stuff that the police at the time buried because they had a suspect that they thought would be an easy scapegoat. With all this, they decided to go to the courts and have them look at the case for a second time, this time with the hope of proving that George was innocent. The motion for a new trial was submitted on October 25, 2014, though the families of Betty and Mary were less than pleased. They were under the belief, and still are, that George killed their family members. A niece of Betty had stated that she feels justice was served, saying in an interview, "People who just read these articles in the newspaper don't know the truth," though she admitted that the trial was one-sided. She railed against the depiction of George in a way that could be considered racist nowadays, so I'm not going to go into it. And there's a reason I'm not naming her. Racist people do not deserve to be acknowledged on my channel. Let's just say she thinks the depiction of him as innocent is wrong. She also claimed that H.S. Newman visited her in 1990 and told her to never believe that George was innocent. But another niece of Betty's put it better. Though that one believes that George Jr. was guilty, she felt sorry for the Stinney family and that George Jr. should not have been put to death. In my opinion, H.S. Newman was a racist jackass and told the families of Betty and Mary this just because he wanted to cover his own tracks. Because his lies killed a child and the real killer got away with it. But guess what? On December 16, 2014, George Stinney Jr.'s conviction was vacated. Judge Cameron Mullen presided over the case and found that not only were George Jr.'s rights heavily infringed upon, but that he did not have adequate representation. She ruled that the confessions were not written down and not uttered once by George Jr., and were most likely coerced and inadmissible. And finally, that executing a 14-year-old boy was ruled as cruel and unusual punishment. Judge Mullen wrote, "No one can justify a 14-year-old child charged, tried, and convicted and executed in some 80 days. In essence, not much was done for this child when his life lay in the balance." Judge Mullen also stated that he could have committed the crime, but we will never know because everything from the investigation to the trial was rushed and not thoroughly looked into. So while his conviction was overturned, that's all it was overturned. In the eyes of the law, his guilt is questionable. But in the eyes of the law, his civil rights were violated and that the trial should never have happened. But in my opinion, he was innocent the entire time, and that trial should never have happened. So who could be the true killer? Here is something left out of the trial. A witness claimed to have seen Betty and Mary hop into the truck of a white man not long after meeting George and Amy. That man was yet another George. Man, George was a very popular name back then. But George Burke Jr., someone who the Stinney family knew very well, because his father, George Burke Sr., was George Stinney Sr.'s boss, and that Burke Sr. had made advances to George Stinney Sr.'s wife. Burke Jr. had a truck, knew the Stinney family well, and knew everyone in town, and the church where the girls' bodies were found was owned by Burke Sr. It was the Burkes who pointed the blame at George Stinney Jr. as well, and it was Burke Jr. who found the bodies of Mary and Betty. In 1947, Burke Jr. died. It is said that on his deathbed he confessed to the murders. But the families of Betty and Mary both think it's fake. In fact, there is very little evidence of that happening. Could it have been Burke Jr.? Maybe. We will never know who really did it, because the police decided that a 14-year-old boy who had a passing conversation with the two girls, who was shadowed all day by his own sister, who had no evidence linking him to the crime, was the real killer. George Stinney Jr. wasn't a killer. He was the victim of racist policies. 3 children lost their lives in this case, and the real killer went free and successfully framed a 14-year-old boy.